Right. So the recording is now in progress. I'm Abigail Adkins with the Education Law Advocacy Project. We are part of Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services, and today we're going to be talking about tools for reading advocacy. This presentation is also going to be available later today in Spanish. That will be presented by my colleague, Ruben Champa, who is here in the group with us today. And before we dive into the material, I want to give our heartfelt thanks to the sponsor for this training series, which is the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities. The Governor's Council for Developmental Disabilities provides a wide range of services for people throughout the state, including advocacy services and support services as well. So thank you for their sponsorship. And just to give you a brief overview about SMERLS, or Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services, we are the oldest legal aid program in Minnesota, and we serve 33 counties across southern Minnesota, including the East Metro area. Eligibility for free legal services through SMERLS just requires that you are a resident within our county boundaries, income at or below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, with some assets, limitations, and restrictions based on the types of services we can provide. Now, SMERLS does a wide range of legal work, including family law, housing, immigration, public benefits, elder-focused law, and education law, which is what the ELAP Education Law Advocacy Project does. So ELAP has been part of SMERLS since 1995, and we are solely focused on helping families with low income enforce their educational legal rights. We do that through a collaborative approach to representation, where we seek to build long-term relationships with schools and families, ensure that students get the services that they need, and that once we are no longer involved, parents feel empowered to advocate on behalf of their kids. So again, it's sort of like a three-step process. We work to obtain educational opportunities for students. We try to address any barriers that are impeding that child's ability to learn, and we try to empower parents to be involved in their kids' education. We work in a wide variety of areas. Pretty much anything that can happen in a school system is something that we can help with. However, we do have some certain priorities: special education services, reading below grade level, which is going to be the topic of what we're talking about today, discrimination, the rights of English language learners, and issues that have to do with school behaviors like bullying and harassment, suspensions and expulsions. So what does SMERLS and ELAP do after we take a case? So the client would go through intake. We would have a discussion internally and decide if this is an issue we can help with. Then we will work with the family to do an investigation into the educational issues, which includes getting releases of information, reviewing school records, and giving advice. Now, if an issue can be solved just with advice, which many of them can be, we would end there. However, if there are legal issues that would benefit from having an attorney represent a family, then we can enter into negotiations with the school district. We can attend IEP meetings, expulsion hearings at the school, and there are different levels of representation that are needed for different types of cases. And then we can also help with dispute resolution if things are not able to be resolved at a more informal level. And we are able to file complaints to state agencies and federal agencies and represent clients if there are administrative hearings or court cases. Okay, so before we dive into the information in today's presentation, I do want to have just a reflection question, which is I want you to think back to your childhood. And do you remember learning how to read? Do you remember if that was a process that was very easy for you and you loved books, or a process that was challenging and you struggled to engage with written material the way you maybe saw other peers? And if it was easy for you, do you remember any kids your age who struggled with reading? So I was one of those children where I loved reading. It came very easily to me. But I had younger siblings who had a much harder time. And it wasn't because they didn't love books, they loved reading, but it took them longer and it was harder for them. And the reason why I'm bringing up this reflection question is because as adults, we often forget the emotional toll that happens when a child is not able to read. It can change the whole course of their academics and even their life. And unfortunately, we've found that here in Minnesota, there are a lot of kids who are struggling to read and have fallen behind. So I want to talk a little bit about the achievement gap. And the achievement gap is a term for the difference in academic achievement between groups of students. Now, professionals and educators know that reading is the foundation of academic achievement, and that where there are disparities in how students perform in school, it often correlates to deficits in their reading skills. I want to dive in a little bit into what's called the National Report Card. Um, that is a annual report that comes out from the National Center for Education Statistics. And the most recent report in 2024 looked across the nation, but specifically at Minnesota, and found that there were significant disparities between students of different genders, races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic statuses. And this was across different subjects, across the ages that are sampled, which is fourth and eighth grade. Um, and the students who are most at risk of suffering from this achievement gap are English learners and multilingual students, students who might face discrimination in school based on a protected status, students with disabilities, and students who are experiencing homelessness or are in foster care. Now, I want to dive in and take a closer look at one specific area of this NAES National Report Card. Um, and uh, you can go to the National Report Card website, and it has a fabulous database of longitudinal academic scores and scores across the nation. But I want to just hone in on 2024 and fourth graders in reading. And the reason why this is an important um, metric is because fourth grade is the point at which students are expected to have mastered the foundational skills in reading, because that is the point at which reading materials become more complex. They become more focused on building knowledge and less on learning how to read itself. And the scores in Minnesota you know, were frankly just not great, because there's a very high percentage of fourth graders who are not meeting the national reading standards. So this is what's called below basic standard. Um, and that's what's highlighted in red in this chart. So the students who are not meeting basic standards, that's 28% of white students, 58% of Black students, 59% of Hispanic students, 72% of students who are English learners, 70% of students with special education services, and 57% of low-income students. So you can see from these numbers that some of the kids who have the most vulnerabilities are the ones who are falling behind in larger proportions. So what is being done to get kids reading? And this is um, a huge movement, not just in Minnesota, but across the nation, in response to these kind of dramatic and long-term deficits in reading. And that's a revamping and a reimagining of what reading instruction and curriculums look like in order to make sure that they align with scientific research about how we learn how to read. So what's happening in our brains when we see words on a page and we read them? Take a look at this diagram. I won't go through it in detail, but it highlights all of the different areas that are lighting up in our brain when we go through this process of reading that for many people feels automatic. But it's actually a super complex process that involves how we hear sounds, which is receptive language, how we make sounds, which is expressive language. And this is not to ignore the language that is American Sign Language, which both involves receptive language and expressive language through signs. But our brain is also needing to understand sound patterns that make up language. That's how we can understand like grammar and pronunciation, and hear when things sound right versus when they sound incorrect. Your brain is utilizing its short-term memory when we remember what a sentence or paragraph says. Sometimes short-term memory doesn't always work and you have to reread the sentence because you've already forgotten what it said, but that's your short-term memory. It also helps you break down written words into sounds so that you can sound them out by syllables. It involves your long-term memory, which is how do you recognize a symbol that's a written letter and then pairing that symbol with the sound that it represents, and also looking at a string of symbols which makes up a word, and then can you remember what that word means if you hear it or if you see it written. And then our brain also, just beyond the process of translating written letters into sounds, into words, is also going through a big process of problem solving, which involves being able to figure out what a word means based on context clues or prior knowledge, and then creating meaning from those words when we talk about reading comprehension. So all of these things are happening in our brains. And some people, this comes very quickly. It almost seems like some children are able to learn how to read naturally, just through being exposed by books and hearing new words. And for many years, that was sort of the idea of how to teach kids to read. Expose them to books, let them see things that fascinate them, that engage them and their imaginations, and that they will, through that process, develop how to read. However, this doesn't apply to all children. Some children need specific reading education. And the simple fact of the matter is that the science of reading shows is that even if children are able to read naturally, all children can benefit from what's called explicit and systematic instruction. And that is what the science of reading seeks to do, specifically teaching students how to connect sounds to the letter of the alphabet. So like it shows on this chart here, A, apple, B, book, C, cat. Really honing in the sound to letter recognition. And so science of reading research shows that Evidence-based instruction will use evidence-based methods. It will follow a structured plan to build foundational reading skills. Put a little star in your mind on that phrase, foundational reading skills, because we're going to keep coming back to it. And the reading instruction should be able to be adapted. So that means it shouldn't be cookie cutter, one size fits all reading education. It needs to be able to shift and address the individual needs of different students based on their culture, based on their home languages, based on whether or not they have a disability. And the most important shift with the science of reading from how things were done before to how they're doing now is that instruction should not teach students to rely on using context or pictures that might appear in a book around a word to guess what that word is. Context clues are helpful, but students, especially students who have difficulties with those foundational reading skills, tend to over rely on guessing, and that causes a snowball effect of reading deficits as they are exposed to more and more complex materials. So it might work when they're in K through 3, but then they get to 4th, 5th, middle, and high school, and the guessing just gets harder and harder. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of a dive into what are foundational reading skills. This gets a little technical, but just think of it as introducing yourself to the words that you might see in a child's kind of educational records and reading reports. And the real takeaway here is why these foundational skills are important. So the first foundational skill is called phonological awareness. That means, do you understand the different parts of a spoken language? Do you understand that a word forms a sentence, that a syllable forms a word? So the syllables are the small sounds that make up a word. Are you able to do rhymes and recognize when that cat rhymes with hat, rhymes with bat? And are you able to do alliterations where you know that things that start with the same sound often start with the same letter? Then there's phonemic awareness, which sounds very similar to phonological awareness. And they are linked, but they are slightly different. So phonemic awareness is, do you understand how to make those sounds and then use those sounds to create words of your own? And this often comes in when a student is learning how to sound out a word or is blending syllables together to make new words. And then we have phonics. Phonics is being able to look at written words, knowing what sounds the letters of the alphabet can make, and knowing kind of common letter pairs like TH makes th, CH makes ch. And then we have decoding. Decoding is then using those phonics letter sounds to kind of problem solve and figure out how to say a word as it's written, and how to read and spell unfamiliar words. And then fluency is your ability to put all of those sounds together in a way that is smooth and accurate. So in this chart, you'll see that the different aspects of foundational reading skills are overlapping. And that is because these are skills that build upon each other as kids move from kindergarten through 3rd grade. K through 3 is a very important time frame in reading. That's when students need to be mastering these foundational reading skills. And that's because if you miss one of these skills, which is very common for students to perhaps, have one area that they're weaker in than others, it makes it harder to continue to advance into more complex reading materials as you go from grade to grade. So this is just an interesting little Fun fact, did you know that English has 26 letters, 44 sounds, and that words are not always spelled how they sound in comparison to Spanish, which has 27 letters, but only 22 individualized sounds, depending on what dialect of Spanish might be spoken. But Spanish is a language where there's a very strong correlation between the sound and the letter, which can make things like spelling simpler for Spanish speakers in comparison to English speakers, where the spelling often does not match the sound. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the science of reading, the foundational reading skills. Now, how do we actually help students who are struggling with reading? And the first step is simply to recognize the signs. How do we know that a child might be struggling with reading? Now, the obvious answer is, well, they took a test on their reading skills and it says they're reading below grade level. But oftentimes there are signs before that point that can be an important inflection point for parents and advocates to step in and do some early intervention advocacy. So for early readers, pre-K and kindergarten, things to look out for is if this is a child who slow to speak or has difficulty pronouncing words, that can be a sign of a speech delay. It can also be a sign that the child has issues with their receptive or their expressive language, which could be a developmental delay. And that can also be indicated by children who have a hard time learning the alphabet. They forget letters. They're not able to identify the shape that a letter is. And then they have trouble learning the sounds that letter makes. Just thinking back to that chart, apple. That might be a hard connection for some early readers. And that's a great time to step in and look to see if reading interventions are helpful. Then we have kind of things to look out for at the elementary stage. So that could be a hard time identifying words that rhyme, a child who will not try to sound out an unfamiliar word. They might read either very slowly because they're trying so hard but struggling to make those connections between the symbol, letter, and the sound that it makes, or a child who will read very quickly, kind of rushing through, not stopping if they make mistakes. And they might also skip words or guess a word that they don't know if they're reading out loud. So sometimes that might be something like, oh, this is the word business. The grocery store is a business in my neighborhood, and they might not recognize the word business, but it looks kind of like buses. And so they might just say the wrong word because they're guessing based on the letters that they see and a word that they already know that looks similar. So then what are the signs that a child might struggle with reading? And oftentimes, once you've gotten to that middle and high school phase, the signs that a child is struggling with reading stop looking like academic problems and they start looking like behavior problems. And that is because this is a child who has struggled with reading, has perhaps not gotten the help that they needed, and they don't want to put themselves in the position anymore of feeling like they're falling behind, feeling like they're not as smart as other kids. And so this might be a child who will avoid reading out loud. They don't want to participate in class. If they get, if the teacher calls popcorn for them and it's their turn to read out loud, they might refuse. This is a kid who, if they're taking a test, they might just rush through it, just putting down any answers because it's too uncomfortable for them to struggle and know that they're not understanding things that for their age group they think they ought to. And oftentimes when reading difficulties have gone unaddressed for all of these years, kids develop negative emotions about school that can lead to depression, anxiety, behavior issues, truancy, and school skipping. So we have a child, we think this might be someone who needs additional support in reading. How do we then go and confirm that they do need that assistance? And the answer is that we're going to request an evaluation. There are different types of evaluations, and I want you to turn your attention to this pyramid. It is called the MTSS framework. MTSS stands for multi-tiered systems of supports. And this is a way that schools can sort of hone in on who needs help. So at the base of the pyramid, you're going to see what's called Tier 1 general supports. That is what the school can provide to all students to help. Then you're going to see Tier 2 targeted supports. These are additional supports or interventions that can be put quickly into place. These are just for those students who we've recognized need more than the general supports given to everybody. And then we have Tier 3 at the very top. So this is the smallest number of students because these are intensive services that are individualized because there's been a finding based on evidence that Tier 2 interventions were not sufficient to meet the child's needs. Okay, so the MTSS framework is used in a lot of different types of educational programs. And in Minnesota, it is the way that schools are supposed to be addressing the needs of reading students. So let's talk about academic evaluations and where those might fit in this pyramid. There is a law in Minnesota called the READ Act. This is the law that has gone into effect over the last couple of years in order to shift Minnesota from previous ways of teaching reading to these new science-based reading instructions. And with the READ Act has the goal to get all kids reading at grade level. Right now, the focus is on K through 3, that really important window to develop foundational reading skills. And so the law requires that from kindergarten to 3rd grade, that the schools are screening students on their fundamentals or foundational reading skills 3 times a year. That should be spring or fall, winter, and spring. And also that kids K through 3 are being screened for what are called characteristics of dyslexia, and that should be happening once each school year. For those children who are not reading on grade level, the school has the ability to move them from that Tier 1 general approach to a Tier 2 targeted approach through what's called a personal learning plan. Now, there are also evaluations into reading that can be done that relate to disabilities and special education services. There's a 504 plan evaluation. We'll be talking about this in more detail later in the presentation, but a 504 plan might fall into that Tier 2 or Tier 3 targeted category. And there's also individual education plans, which is specialized supports through what's called an IEP, and those would fall into that Tier 3 intensive category because it's specific to the individual student and not given to all students broadly. All right, here we just have some examples of different types of reading interventions and where they might fall on this multi-tiered system of supports pyramid. Is it the broad general ones, the more specific targeted ones, or the very individualized intensive supports? All right, so we know a little bit about the signs that a child might need help with reading and the types of evaluations that schools can do to confirm that the child needs additional help in reading. So now we're going to talk through questions that parents and advocates should ask when they have a belief, a reason to believe that their child is not reading on grade level. All right, so let's start with early readers. What can you ask? You can ask, is my child meeting developmental milestones? Does my child speak, draw, write at the appropriate level for their age? And it's that for their age part that is very important, because especially in the early years, there can be a range of how long it might take for children to develop certain skills. But if they are not on track developmentally, it's very helpful to get early interventions rather than waiting until kindergarten or first grade. You can also ask, what sounds and letters has my child mastered? And now this next question is the most important question. You'll see it in all of the slides to come, which is my child able to listen, focus, and answer questions during reading activities? Listen, focus, and answer. Because if your child is not able to do any of those, or is even just missing one or two of those parts, they're not going to be able to benefit from the instruction in reading, and they're going to fall further behind. And then finally, you can ask, what activities can we do at home to practice reading skills? All right, so what should you ask your child's teacher at the elementary stage? Again, you want to focus on those foundational reading skills. So which skills does my child need to master by the end of the school year? How does my child do when reading independently? Is my child able to decode unfamiliar words? Meaning, if they run into a word that they don't know, can they figure it out using these fundamental foundational reading skills? What sight words should my child know? Sight words are small words, a, and, the, but, of, things like that, that a child should just memorize. It helps the child have a framework to be able to see the word, know what it is, and recognize it so that they don't have to sound out all of the words individually. And it helps with reading fluency and making reading become more of an automatic process. So another question, this is for maybe children who are a little bit older, once they've gotten past the sight words phase, which is, what types of reading comprehension questions should my child be able to answer after they've read a passage? Sometimes that's, can you identify the main character? Can you tell me what's happening? Parents, you should also be asking to see some examples of your students' classwork. See their writing, see their reading assignments. And again, is my child able to listen, focus, and answer questions during class? Now, once your child is in that K-3 range, you also want to be asking, when was their last reading assessment? Are there any foundational skills that my child needs to work on? If so, what extra supports are available from the school to help improve reading? You can even ask if there are summer programs that the child would benefit from so that they don't forget or fall back on some of the skills that they have mastered during the school year. All right, so middle school. This becomes one of those difficult time periods where getting your child to talk about what's happening in school themselves is even harder. And so parents and advocates need to make sure that they have strong communication with the school themselves. And you want to know, is my child reading on grade level? Does my child engage in what they're learning? Are they participating in class? Or are we starting to see some of those steps where children start to withdraw, start to shut down, and not want to engage with stuff that they feel like they can't do well Can my child demonstrate for you verbally and in writing what they have learned? Can my child write clearly and use proper spelling and grammar? This is something that is extremely important once you've reached middle school and you're starting to have to write essays and do more independent research, that you have a strong grasp of spelling and grammar. Um, and then how does my child handle new and challenging material? Do they feel like they can ask for help? Do they enjoy learning new things? Um, what information should my child be able to pull out of a reading passage? Can they identify the main idea, the themes, facts versus opinions? These all represent that switch that should be happening starting in fourth grade, but moving into middle school as a child starts um, reading less to learn how to read and more reading for information and learning purposes. And again, you really want to hone in on foundational reading skills. It is so important in this middle school time frame that if there are gaps or deficits in those foundational skills, that a child gets the interventions that they need, and they have them in place as soon as possible prior to high school, so that they don't lose momentum. All right, and now let's look at high school. So again, you want to make sure that you're covering all the bases. Is my child reading on grade level? Are there still any foundational skills that they need to work on? And you also want to ask about your child's participation in class. Are they active learners? Do they seek out help when they don't understand something? Still important to make sure that grammar and spelling is in place. And if not, what can be done to make sure that they're improving on those things? You want to make sure also that children are taking the types of classes in middle school and most importantly in high school that will prepare them for college or career. The reason why this is so important is because students' grades are not always an indicator of whether or not they will be successful in college. And the reason for that is that grades can be entered in on a wide variety of bases. You know, some teachers are very big on encouraging participation, encouraging students retaking tests, things like that. And that's really good. It's important that kids are able to um, improve on their mistakes and that they stay engaged with their education. However, you can have a student who's making decent grades, maybe a mix of A's, B's, and C's, um, but they might struggle when they get to um, a college setting or a higher education setting because there's not those same opportunities to make up missed work or to retake exams. And if they have deficits in their foundational skills, um, they might find that they're not ready for college level classes, and either sometimes they might be at risk of dropping out or not completing higher education or having to spend additional money on remedial classes in college. So here in high school, it's not too late to get those foundational reading skills shored up to pull those up to where they need to be, especially for kids who are engaged and desire to make those improvements. However, it's very important that if a student is behind in grade levels, even if their grades look okay, even if they're on track to graduate, that we don't forget about those foundational reading skills. All right, so persistent reading difficulties might be not just an indication that a child needs some more targeted and systemic education or instructional interventions. It can also be due to an underlying disability. And the sort of umbrella term that we use for these is specific learning disabilities, or SLDs. So let's talk a little bit about what SLDs are, and then we'll look at what SLDs are not. So again, SLD, it's an umbrella term. It refers to a brain-based condition that might impact your ability to understand and use spoken or written language. So the SLD will make it difficult for a student to listen, think, speak, or write, which again is going to impact their ability to make academic progress and learn new material. There are specific conditions, these are not all of them, but that correlate to these academic areas. So if there is a brain-based condition or disability that affects your reading, that might be diagnosed as dyslexia. If it affects your writing, it might be diagnosed as dysgraphia. If it affects your math skills, it might be diagnosed as dyscalculia. It's very important to know that a specific learning disability does not necessarily require a medical diagnosis to receive services in school. However, and the opposite is true, is that a medical diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean that you are eligible for services in school. It all depends on how that disability is actually manifesting in the student's reading, writing, and mathematic processes. All right, so that's what a SLD is. Now let's look to the column in red to talk about what SLDs are not. So an SLD is not a vision or hearing problem. An SLD is not a physical disability, and it is not an intellectual disability or a mental health issue. Now, all of these things can happen alongside of a specific learning disability. In fact, it's very common for people to have multiple conditions. But when we're talking just about what services would make you eligible for SLD services in school, it's not going to be the things that are listed in red. Now, and this is another important point. A specific learning disability is not caused by a lack of proper education. So say you have a child who went to school, but their reading curriculum was not science-based, not backed by evidence, and this child is reading very poorly below grade level. The lack of science-based specific education does not mean that the child has a specific learning disability. If the child is able to make improvements when given the proper education, then you know it's an education issue. If there are still difficulties, then that might be an indication of an underlying disability or an SLD. And an SLD is also not caused by being from a specific demographic group. Learning disabilities happen in all people of all backgrounds and socioeconomic classes. All right, so what services are available for students with an SLD? And again, this comes with the caveat that you have to look not just at the diagnosis, but how that diagnosis is impacting the student's education in reading, writing, mathematics. So the first law that protects services for students with SLDs is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA or IDEA. That's a federal law that requires public schools to identify, evaluate, and provide eligible students with disabilities what's called a free and appropriate public education by providing those students with special education services. So a child with a disability who qualifies for special education under the IDEA has to need specialized instruction in order to make appropriate academic progress. Again, there has to be that tie between the condition or the disability and how it is showing up in their academics. In order to qualify, the school has to go through a special education evaluation, and that special education evaluation can be requested by the school or the parent. Now, this is something important to remember. You don't have to wait until you've gone through all of the tiers, thinking back to that MTSS pyramid. You don't have to wait until you've gone through all of the steps of the pyramid before you request that evaluation. The evaluation can happen alongside of the other types of interventions that might happen at a lower tier of the MTSS pyramid. But if you do go through that evaluation process and it is found that the child has specialized needs, then the parents and the school will develop what's called an individual education plan that should be updated annually. There's also another law that protects the rights of students who have a specific learning disability in school, and that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. They're two different laws, but they kind of go together. And so the ADA and 504 are federal laws that require that students provide access and accommodations. Now, that's an important phrase. Access and accommodations are not the same as special education. And the reason why is that the focus is less on instruction that happens and more about participation. The child's disability is something that impacts their participation in school activities and extracurriculars. And there doesn't need to be as involved of an evaluation process. Usually it's sufficient if the parent provides medical documentation and explains the issue that the child's having. School and parent will come together and they'll create what's called a 504 plan that describes the disability, the student's needs, and will list out accommodations that the school needs, or that the child needs to participate in school, excuse me. Some common accommodations are things like extra time to finish assignments, the ability to take breaks during the day, access to talk to a school counselor or nurse. Sensory supports is a pretty common one now. Things like having noise canceling headphones or fidget toys. All right, so we've talked about the general ways that reading issues can show up for students. We've talked about specific learning disabilities and how that impacts reading. It's also really important for us to address reading skills for English language learners. So first of all, students who are English language learners or EL students, their first language is not English, or they speak another language other than English, usually at home. And so it's not just having a different language, it's having a different language, and they do not have sufficient English skills in order to participate fully in a classroom that is taught in English. So it has to be both. Another spoken language at home and not enough English language skills to participate in class. And the typical way that EL students are identified is through what's called a home language survey. And then the school should offer an age-appropriate assessment to determine whether or not the child meets the appropriate levels of understanding, speaking, writing, and reading in English. If a child is found eligible for an EL program, they will need to be enrolled. Now, I want to take a moment here to pause and just say, all of the questions that we talked about in the earlier section about what to ask your teacher, all of those apply for students who are English language learners. The same questions. And the reason for that is that even though EL programs are separate from general education programs, the school still has a responsibility to make sure that that child who speaks another language and needs to increase their English language skills is learning how to read at an appropriate level. So this might be a different program, and it's also a different tier in the MTSS pyramid. It's not a general tier. It's the targeted tier, because not every student has to, take these additional classes or has these multilingual student needs. But the school still has the same responsibility. So, English learner program requirements. Different districts have different ways that they set up their programs for English learners. But the general requirements is that parents have to be encouraged to involved. It has to be based on a sound educational theory. So that means that other if general education students are learning based on the science to read, the programs for EL students have to as well. There has to be sufficient staff and funding. There has to be ongoing evaluations to make sure that the program works. And for subjects where English isn't used very often, such as art, music, or gym, EL students should not be segregated or kept away from general education. They should be allowed to participate to the same levels. And English learners and their parents have rights. So again, school cannot segregate English learners from other programs and other students. There has to be sufficient support for them in their general education class. They can't only be in an EL setting. They have to have support in the general education class as well. Parents need to be communicated with in a language that they understand. There has to be notification to parents if a child is enrolled in an EL program. The parent has to get that notice in writing in a language they understand. The parent has the ability to visit the English learner program. And if they choose so, they have the ability to remove their child or re-enroll their child based on what they feel is best. All right, so I'll open it briefly to questions. And if anyone has questions that they'd like to submit, you can always reach out to us in writing if you've watched this program virtually. I want to thank everybody who's participated in these trainings so much. We are excited for the different opportunities to connect with you. Please check out our 2025 handbook on student rights and advocacy. It covers most of the laws in Minnesota that pertain to students and education, and it provides lots of resources as well. We update this every